They did everything right until one small mistake made everything go wrong. On May 4th of 1946, Alcatraz was no longer just a prison. It had become a battlefield. Gunfire cracked through concrete corridors. The smell of smoke and explosives hung in the air, and the United States Marines moved with military precision through a place that had been designed to prevent exactly this kind of chaos. But by the time they arrived, the damage had already been done. To understand how we reached that point, you have to step back into the mindset of the men who lived there, if you can call it living. Alcatraz was not built to rehabilitate, it was built to contain. The prisoners sent there were not first time offenders or even minor criminals. They were men who had already proven they could not be controlled elsewhere. They were escape artists, violent offenders, and individuals who had turned incarceration into a challenge rather than a punishment. It was a game to them. The message of Alcatraz was simple: you are not leaving. But that message had a weakness. It assumed perfection, and perfection, of course, is fragile. Bernard McCoy understood that better than anyone. Coy was not impulsive. He was observant. Given the role of a cell house orderly, he had more freedom of movement than most cellmates did. The freedom allowed him to study routines. He was able to watch the guards, to notice patterns, and most importantly, to identify a flaw. Above the main cell house sat the gun gallery. It was the prison's advantage point where the armed guards could oversee everything below them. It was supposed to be unreachable. The bars protecting it were meant to be absolute. But they were not. Coy realized that with the right pressure applied slowly over time, those bars could be spread just enough to create an opening. Not a comfortable one, and certainly not an easy one, but an opening nonetheless. There was only one problem. Coy's body would not fit. So he made his decision that speaks volumes to the level of commitment behind his plan. He began to starve himself. Slowly and deliberately, he was reducing his size so that when the moment came, he could force his way through that narrow gap. This was not desperation in the heat of the moment, but this was calculated, planned, endured. And what's more, he was not alone. Marvin Hubbard, Joseph Kretzer, Clarence Carnes, they all later joined by Stam Shockley and Mirren Thompson. Each one brought something different. There was experience, violence, youth, and desperation. Together, they built a plan that, on paper, could absolutely work. On May 2nd of 1946, they put that plan into motion. The timing was precise. Many guards were occupied. Movement within the cell house was predictable. Coy started everything off by attacking the guard William Miller from behind while another cellmate distracted him. They overpowered him, took his keys, and began unlocking cells. Coy moved to the gun gallery. He squeezed through those slightly widened bars, which was an act that required both physical endurance and sheer determination over quite a period of time, and overpowered the armed guards stationed there. Suddenly, the inmates had access to rifles, pistols, and control over a critical part of the prison, and the balance shifted instantly. It was like the snap of the fingers. Other inmates were freed. Guards were captured. Doors that had never meant to be opened began to swing. And for a brief moment, it looked possible. They gathered what they needed. They had weapons, keys, hostages. The plan was to move through the yard door to reach the dock and to take a boat. From there, the waters of San Francisco Bay would be their final obstacle. This was a bold and dangerous plan, and it was almost within reach. Everything depended on one thing: the yard door key. When they found it, everything should have fallen into place. But it did not. The key would not turn. Earlier in their search, they had tried multiple keys in the lock. Each attempt had damaged it slightly. Not enough to notice the lock damage at the time, but it had been enough. By the time they found the correct key, the lock itself had been ruined. The door would not open. That meant that the moment, their plan, everything died. Not with a gunshot, not with a guard, but with a simple, unseen failure. The men were trapped. They were inside a prison already designed to prevent escape. They were inside a situation that they had created. And now there was no way out. So what happens next is not escape, but escalation, of course. More guards entered during routine checks, and they were captured. At one point, 9 officers were being held hostage. The inmates were, of course, armed. The guards were vulnerable. The tension reached a point where control no longer existed. Shots were fired. They were not warning shots. They were not accidental, but deliberate. Guard William Miller was shot and later died from his injuries. Guard Harold Stites was killed during the response. He was struck by friendly fire during the chaos. Violence had replaced strategy, and once that happens, there is no going back. The alarm spread through the island. Alcatraz was calling for help, and help came in the form of the United States Marines. Think about that for a moment. A federal prison required military intervention to regain control on an isolated island. The Marines approached the situation as they would a fortified enemy position. They did not rush in blindly. They assessed, they adapted, and they used tactics developed in war. Remember, this is 1946. This is right after World War II. So at this point, the electricity is cut, their movement is controlled, and positions were secured by the Marines. They began to push the inmates into tighter spaces using gunfire and grenades to force them out of defensible positions. And the inmates tried to negotiate. They called the warden and asked for a deal. The response was simple enough: surrender. Well, of course they refused, because by that point, surrender didn't feel like an option. They had crossed way too many lines. They made way too many irreversible decisions, and the situation dragged on through the night. Gunfire echoed through steel and concrete. Explosions shook the structure. Men on both sides moved carefully, knowing that one mistake could absolutely be their last. And then on the morning of May 4th of 1946, it all ended. Armed teams advanced into the final area. They moved through the corridors and cleared the spaces, and they found the bodies of Bernard Coy, Marvin Hubbard, Joseph Kretzer. They were dead. The remaining participants were taken into custody, and the battle was over. But the consequences were just beginning. Sam Shockley and Mirren Thompson were later executed for their roles in the killings. Clarence Carnes, the youngest, was spared after testimony revealed that he had not participated in the murder of the hostages. He would spend years in prison and be released and return and eventually die behind bars anyway for a separate crime. But 5 people lost their lives that day. It was 3 inmates and 2 guards. 14 officers were injured, and Alcatraz remained standing. It wasn't quite the same, though, because the myth of absolute control had been broken, all because of the one flaw. There was just this one overlooked detail, one lock that did not hold up under pressure. They were close, closer than anyone expected. They had the weapons, they had the hostages, and they had the plan. And in the end, they were undone not by overwhelming force, but by their own actions. They broke the very mechanism that they needed to escape. They created their own prison inside the prison. That's the kind of irony that history does not forget. So here's the question I want you to think about for a moment, and answer this in the comments. You know I love reading your comments. If that lock had not been damaged, if that door had opened the way it was supposed to that day, do you believe that they would have made it off of the island? Or do you think something else would have stopped them before they ever reached freedom? And of course, if you enjoy stories like this, make sure you follow the Facebook page for more deep dives into history's most fascinating moments and subscribe to the History Happens podcast so you never miss an episode.